name is Allison Bell, and I'm an instructor for Manhattan Prep. I've been teaching LSAT courses and tutoring LSAT students for about 8 or 9 years now with Manhattan Prep. I took the LSAT myself when I was in college, but decided ultimately not to go to law school and instead became a public school teacher. So for me, this is a really nice way to work with adults and help people prepare for an amazing career as a lawyer and help see people succeed and achieve their dreams. Tonight's free prep hour is going to focus on logical reasoning. After class tonight, if you decide that you're interested in exploring some other free options for prep, a couple of things that you can do. Our LSAT classes are 10 sessions long, and you're always welcome to try one of our session 1 classes. And they're really informative. The first session is a full-on logical reasoning and logic games lesson, and you can try it for free. We have in-person classes in most major metropolitan areas, and then we have quite a few online offerings as well if you're not located near one of our centers. We also have a really great self-study tool called LSAT Interact. It features a bunch of our instructors teaching LSAT topics that show up in our courses and in our books. But the way that it works is you'll do a problem and then you'll select your answer, and the interactive video will adapt based on the answer that you chose. So it might say something like, you got that question right. Do you want to review it or do you want to just keep moving? Or it'll say, oh, that answer you picked is what we call a premise booster. Let me teach you about that. So it's kind of the closest thing that you can get to having a real live class with a real live teacher without actually doing that. And you can sample that for free on our website. So if you're interested, try some of those out after we finish our lesson tonight. But let's talk about our plan for today. So as I mentioned, our focus is going to be on logical reasoning. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on a certain type of question that shows up frequently on logical reasoning, and that is called a sufficient assumption question. These are kind of the backbone of a lot of other types of questions that show up on logical reasoning as well. So learning how to handle a sufficient assumption question is super helpful for other types of questions too. Today we're going to make sure that you can recognize a sufficient assumption question when you see it. And then we're going to talk about some of the common correct answers and sort of strategies that you can develop for finding and predicting those correct answers. And we're also going to talk about some of the common incorrect answers that show up on these question types. I'm curious how many of you are already familiar with the concept of a sufficient assumption, and for how many of you is it new? So I'm going to ask you if you can find, I know a few of you are just joining, let me know in the chat window. You can just tell me I am familiar with sufficient assumptions, or they are new to me, or even a smiley face or a frowny face would do it, although there's certainly nothing wrong with being new to it. Great, okay, so I'm seeing a few people are familiar. So I'll tell you what, before I tell you all about sufficient assumptions, why don't you tell me what you know? Take a moment to type in the chat window, what do you know, just anything at all, like what is a sufficient assumption? What are some strategies you've learned, common traps that you've run into on these types of questions, anything that you can think of. And I'm going to make a little whiteboard for us to brainstorm some of these ideas. So anything you know about sufficient assumptions, tell me in the chat window. Okay, cool. So Serene or Serena, I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong at all, is talking about sufficient in the sense of conditional logic, which is one of the places that we see sufficient assumptions. I'm typing on a whiteboard here, and I want to make sure that everyone can see it. Someone let me know in the chat window, can you see the word sufficient that I just typed on a big white space? Excellent. Okay. So when we do conditional logic, and that's the type of logic that's formal logic, like if A, then B, Serena is absolutely right that the sufficient is a name that we use for this A term. So an example would be if I say, if I eat vegetables, then I will be healthy. One way we use the word sufficient on the LSAT is to describe the left-hand side of this conditional logic statement. We say eating vegetables is sufficient to guarantee that I will end up being healthy. With sufficient assumption questions, we're actually using the word sufficient in a slightly different way. So I'm curious to hear if there are any other ways that you all have thought about it. Yeah, Serena, so the right side of conditional logic will end up being what we call the guarantee or the necessary. But the way that I'm using the word sufficient tonight is kind of just a little bit different from all of this. So all of this is correct. This is a correct way to use the word sufficient on the LSAT and in terms of conditional logic. But tonight we're going to talk about a second way to use the word sufficient. And that's when we use it to talk about sufficient assumptions in general. So why don't we start by trying out a sufficient assumption question so that you can see what these questions are like and see if it rings any bells for you. So here's the question. Let me know if you can't see it. You should see a number 6 followed by a logical reasoning question. And I'm going to time you and give you about 1 minute and 20 seconds. There you go, Serena. Yeah, I think you and I are getting on the same page now. Awesome. All right, so I'm going to give you 1 minute and 20 seconds. And after that time is up, I'm going to give you a poll to tell me what you think the correct answer is here. Okay, you're going to see a poll pop up on your screen, and I'm going to ask you to go ahead and pick what you currently think the best answer is. And if you haven't 100% decided, go ahead and take your best guess the same way that you would want to do so on the LSAT, so that you could move along and work on other questions. Okay, I'll give you about 5 more seconds if you'd like to pull in. Still missing a couple of votes. All right, thank you, everybody. We will get back to, okay, sorry about that. If you didn't see a poll, you can just tell me your answer in the chat window. I'm not sure why that would be, but I'm still happy to hear what you picked. Okay, thank you. All right, so we're going to use this question as our introduction to sufficient assumptions. One of the really important skills that you need to practice on logical reasoning is making sure that when you see a new question and you read the question stem, you know what task you're being asked to do. So I've told you ahead of time that I would classify this particular question as a sufficient assumption question. And I'm curious if anybody can tell me what words from this question stem might have told me that this is a sufficient assumption. And this would probably be something that you would only know if you've already been self-studying a little bit about this particular type of question. So if not, no worries, and I'll teach you. But if you do know, tell me in the chat window what words here indicate sufficient assumption. Okay, so I see the words if assumed being mentioned. Those definitely help. The key words that I actually look at here to help me identify this question type are, yeah, exactly, Sarah and Serena got it, follows logically. And the reason for that is a sufficient assumption is a question that asks me to choose a statement that would make the argument airtight. So if I pick one of these answer choices and I were to say, take answer choice C if it happens to be the correct one and plug it back in, my argument should now be a perfect argument with no holes in it. And the language that the LSAT uses to describe a perfect argument is often this phrase, follows logically. It means that we can't argue with this conclusion if we just add this one sentence that needs to be true to this argument. So I'm going to step away from that question for just a second to give us some context and strategies, and then we'll come right back to it and talk about what the actual answer is. The sufficient assumption question type falls within what we call the assumption family within logical reasoning. So out of all the logical reasoning questions on the LSAT, about half of them fall into this assumption family, which means that they ask you to evaluate an argument and find an assumption, and then perform a particular task with that assumption. So they might ask you, for example, to strengthen or weaken the argument based on the assumption that you found. They might ask you to describe a flaw in that argument based on the assumption that you found. The type of question we're talking about tonight is sufficient assumptions, which is one of these question types that falls within the assumption family. What all of these question types have in common is they contain an argument that includes a premise or support and a conclusion or a final opinion or claim that's being made. And your job is to read the argument, find the premise and the conclusion, and then to also find the assumption or the gap between the premise and conclusion. And we'll see what we mean by that in just a second. So here's some of the language that you'll see for sufficient assumption questions. You can see the same phrasing that we just saw in the question that we tried. The argument's conclusion follows logically if which one of the following is assumed. Another phrase that the LSAT likes to use to describe a perfect argument is that the argument is properly drawn. It's the same concept as if it asks you if the argument follows logically. It means the answer choice that you select, if you were to plug it back in, it should make the argument perfectly valid or 100% airtight. So a lot of times, one of the great things about sufficient assumption questions is that compared to many other types of logical reasoning questions, they are often highly predictable. And one of the skills that you want to practice on sufficient assumption questions is as soon as you see that that's the type of question that you're being asked, you see follows logically or properly drawn, and you say to yourself, okay, this is a predictable question. I should be able to kind of think about what the answer is ahead of time, and I'm pretty likely to see the answer that I predict in my answer choices. That's not always true on these types of logical reasoning questions, but it is for sufficient assumption questions. So here's a very simple example. If I have the premise, people with dogs are happy, and I come to the conclusion, therefore, everyone should buy a dog. What could I say to make this argument true? What could I add sort of in between the premise and the conclusion? Tell me in the chat window, can you come up with a sentence I could say to prove this argument? That's a good start, Serene. Would love to hear from some other people. Serene said people need to be happy. So the big thing that I often end up looking for on sufficient assumptions is what I call a term shift, which means that oftentimes in the premise, there will be one idea that gets introduced, like this idea of happiness, and then the idea that's focused on will shift in the conclusion. They're no longer talking about happiness. Instead, something new pops up. And in this case, they're talking about buying a dog. So the correct answer is going to be something that will connect the term from the premise to the term from the conclusion, the two terms that are not already connected. So it might be something like, if something makes people happy, there's that term from the premise, then they should buy it. There's buy, that term from the conclusion. Oftentimes, the answers to a sufficient assumption question are somewhat formulaic. So if I take this specific example that I'm giving you here and make it more abstract, it's basically saying if the premise of this argument is true, if something makes people happy, then the conclusion is true. People should buy it. So one of the best things that you can do on a sufficient assumption question is identify what's different between the premise and the conclusion, and then think about how you might connect those terms together in perhaps an if-then statement, and then look for that answer in the answer choices. So let's take a look back at the question that we just did. And see if it has a term shift between the premise and the conclusion. So the very first thing that I do, I've identified this as a sufficient assumption question. Before I start predicting answer choices, before I start saying assumptions to myself, I need to be really clear on what the argument is saying, especially for this type of question. So I want to start by finding the conclusion. I'm going to ask you all to tell me in the chat window, what do you think the conclusion is? And feel free to just give me the first word of that phrase and then like the last couple of words so you don't have to type the whole thing. But point me towards which sentence or part of a sentence is the conclusion in this argument. Yeah. gonna change the screen share for just a second so we have a little bit more room to write. So yeah, I see a couple people of chiming in here. I see one person mentioning an answer choice. So just to be clear, the conclusion is always going to be up here in the paragraph that we read at the very beginning. And then the answer choices are going to be something we think about in just a minute. So I start out, I identify the conclusion. A lot of folks have done that correctly, so I'm going to type it over here. My conclusion is that Murray cannot be accepted for the position of executive administrator. Now, in addition to being clear on what the conclusion is, I also want to be clear on what the premise or premises are. So again, you guys did a great job with that. Tell me in the chat window, what are the premises? Why is this argument saying that Murray cannot be accepted for this position? Yeah, the crux of it is this felony conviction, and no one has a felony conviction, or that he has a felony conviction, and you can't be appointed to the board with the felony conviction. So I'm going to kind of lay this argument out. So it says, we know an undergraduate degree is necessary for an appointment. Murray has an undergraduate degree, so that doesn't end up being super important to the conclusion itself. But then it says, if you have a felony conviction, then you cannot be on the board. And Murray has a felony conviction. So then we come to this conclusion: Murray cannot be accepted for the position of executive administrator. I mean, this logic really seems pretty good. Like, it says if you're a felon, you can't be on the board. Murray has a felony conviction. So it seems logical to then draw a conclusion from this that Murray can't be on the board. I mean, you can't contradict the argument. So what's the problem? Does anybody see what is the gap between these premises and this conclusion? Serene, you say the position. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? What do you mean? Oh, yeah, interesting. So over here in the conclusion, we're talking about the position of the executive administrator, not the board. So our logic does clearly tell us in the premises that Murray can't be on the board, but we can't be super sure if the executive administrator is a position on the board because we haven't been told that at all. And we don't want to assume anything when we're given an argument on the LSAT. So we're wondering, is the executive administrator on the board? And if we think about pre-phrasing or predicting a sufficient assumption, then we know that the two big things that we want to connect are this idea of being on the board and the executive administrator. So I'm going to be looking for an answer choice that makes a connection between if you're on the board or if you are an executive administrator, then you must be on the board. Some positive connection between those two. The cool thing about making a prediction like that, which I will remind you is called looking for a term shift. So looking for language that's different from the premise to the conclusion, is if you spot that term shift and you know that those two terms are the ones that need to be connected together, then you can eliminate answer choices that don't have both of those ideas. So any answer choice that doesn't seem like it might make a connection between being on the board and getting this position of executive administrator, I can eliminate. Tell me in the chat window, what answer choices would that get rid of? Which answer choices don't talk about the board and being an executive administrator? Okay, Regina's saying I can eliminate answer choice B. Kelsey's saying I'll accept B. Let's check them out. So I go into each of them. Answer choice A talks about the executive board, but I don't see anything about the executive administrator, so I'm going to get rid of it. B has the executive board and the executive administrator, so I'll keep it. C has the executive administrator, but not the executive board, so I'm going to get rid of it. D has the executive administrator, but doesn't connect it back to the board. I'm going to get rid of it. E has the same issue, executive administrator, not the board. So the only answer choice that has both of the ideas that we need to be connected is answer choice B, which is in fact the correct answer to this question. What I want to have happen if something is the correct answer to a sufficient assumption question is if I take that answer choice and I plug it back in as kind of a final premise, my conclusion will now seem a lot stronger. So I say, okay, if you have a felony, you can't be on the board. Murray has a felony conviction, which we figured out means he can't be on the board. Only candidates eligible for appointment to the board can be accepted for the position of executive administrator. So Murray can't be accepted for the position of executive administrator. You see how that logic kind of has a domino effect to it, where it's one thing links into another, which links into another, which makes our conclusion inevitable. That is what we want to have as a result for the correct answer to a sufficient assumption question. All right, so that's our first question in our introduction to sufficient assumptions. Let me pause for a second and just see if anyone has any questions at all about anything we've discussed so far, including question number 6 here. If so, feel free to click your microphone button and just ask it out loud or type it into the chat window. I'll wait about 10 seconds or so. Okay, not seeing any questions right now, so let me clear this off. And we're going to get a little more practice. Here's a new question. Keep in mind the things that we've already learned, but also be open to the possibility that this question may teach us something different. I'll give you a minute and 20 seconds to try it. Okay, a new poll is coming your way. If it pops up on your screen, go ahead and type in or click your answer. If you don't see it for any reason, feel free to just send me your answer in the chat too. Give it about 5 more seconds. Okay, thank you to everybody who voted. Looks like we might have had some folks responding in the chat too. Awesome, thank you. All right, so we've got a sufficient assumption question. So we want to continue our habit of looking for the premise and the conclusion. Tell me in the chat window, what's the conclusion? Yeah, the early entomologist was wrong, which is a statement that refers to something else that came earlier in the argument. So anytime I have a statement in the conclusion especially that refers back to an earlier part of the argument, I like to rephrase it to make sure that I know not just the words in the conclusion, but what is the idea behind it. So can you tell me, how would we rephrase this? The early entomologist was wrong. What does that mean? Yeah, so the early entomologist said that they saw these ants carrying particles to neighboring ant colonies and inferred this conclusion that the ants were bringing food to their neighbors. But then we got this additional research that proved that that must be wrong. So if I were to rephrase this conclusion, I think Sarah's rephrase is perfect. The rephrase is then the ants were not bringing food to their neighbors. What is the evidence to support this conclusion, or what is the premise? Why do we think ants were not bringing food to their neighbors? Yeah, according to the argument, we get this new research that revealed the ants were emptying their own colonies' dumping sites. And that is what is being used to support this idea that ants were not bringing food to their neighbors. So ants were emptying their own colonies' dumping site. Therefore, ants were not bringing food to their neighbors. Now we could try the term shift strategy, but there's another way of thinking about sufficient assumption questions that I want to introduce to you on this one. And that is the idea that sometimes it's also helpful to consider alternatives to the conclusion and then rule them out. What I mean by that is when we have any LSAT argument, we always accept that the premise is 100% true. Yes, these ants were definitely emptying their dumping site. However, we don't always have to accept that the conclusion is 100% true. So how could it be possible that this conclusion might be wrong? And just bear with me, I'll bring this back to sufficient assumptions in just a second. But for right now, I just want you to think about, how could it be possible that the premise is 100% true, ants were emptying their own colony's dumping site, and yet the conclusion is wrong? What could be another possible way to explain the fact that ants were emptying their own colony's dumping site and come to the conclusion, say, that ants were bringing food to their neighbors? How is that possible? Yeah, so I might think my way out of this conclusion and say, well, just because they were emptying their dumping site doesn't mean they couldn't bring food. Maybe the dumping site had food. That's what we would call an alternative explanation. If I say maybe the dumping site had food in it, all of a sudden that would challenge our conclusion. How do we know that the ants were not bringing food to their neighbors if the dumping site actually had food in it? Then maybe they were just getting food from the dumping site and bringing it over. Now, I don't want to weaken the argument on a sufficient assumption question. I want to help it. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, if I have something that might pose a threat to my argument if it were true, then I might want to say that that is not true. Yeah, I might want to negate it. So I might want to say something like, the dumping site does not have food in it, in order to support my argument. So this is what we would call ruling out an alternative to the conclusion. The alternative is maybe the dumping site has food in it, and I rule it out by saying, no, it doesn't. So we've got this possible threatener to my conclusion, and I can make my conclusion stronger by getting rid of that possible threatener and saying, no, that's definitely not true. That actually ends up being the strategy that takes us through to our correct answer here. So the correct answer to number 5 is C. It matches up with this prediction that we could rule out this alternative, that the dumping site does not have food in it. If we were to plug it back into our original argument, it would say ants were emptying their own colony's dumping site. Ant dumping sites do not contain particles that could be used as food. Therefore, the ants were not bringing food to their neighbors. Well, that makes sense. If there's literally no food in a dumping site, then how could emptying your dumping site result in bringing food to your neighbors? It doesn't seem like it could. So this argument seems pretty strong. Let's stop for a second and think about some of these other answer choices. So I saw several answer choices that were selected here. Yeah, we can definitely start with answer choice E. Thanks for asking, Kelsey. So let me clear off the text a little bit just to give us a nice clean slate, and I'll go back and circle C. So answer choice E, the entomologist retracted his conclusion when it was determined that the particles the ants came from their dumping site. So basically, the entomologist had said, they're bringing food. And then this new evidence came along. And so according to answer choice E, the entomologist now says, I take it back. They're not bringing food. Here's the thing. In this scenario that they're giving you with answer choice E, the entomologist thinks that his or her earlier conclusion was wrong. Does that mean that it actually was wrong? Not necessarily. Maybe the entomologist was originally right and they took back their conclusion based on their evidence, but they were incorrect when they took it back. So what this entomologist believes or doesn't believe doesn't tell us what the actual truth is. This might not be a very good entomologist. Maybe they change their mind all the time. It doesn't mean that they have fully evaluated all of the evidence and that we should just take their word for it. So just having the conclusion reversed or having any sort of statement that only focuses on the conclusion is typically not going to be correct for a sufficient assumption question. We need something that's going to help us with the logic, that's going to help us get from the premise to the conclusion. So I would label answer choice E as something that only deals with the conclusion, but not with the actual logic. It doesn't help us understand what emptying from your dumping site has to do with bringing food. It just helps us understand the entomologist's opinion. Let me know if you have other questions about that one, about answer choice E. And let's take a look at a couple of the other answers that were selected. So a lot of these answer choices are sort of classic what the LSAT would call out of scope. which means they don't really affect the topic. So for example, answer choice A, they do not interact in all the same ways that human societies interact. That's probably true, but we don't know what that has to do with bringing food to your neighbors or emptying your dumping site. And I'd have to do a lot of thinking and probably some outside research to figure out how that would connect back to the argument. So I would call that out of scope, because I'm not sure how human societies would affect this argument. Answer choice B, there is only weak evidence for the view that ants have the capacity to make use of objects as gifts. That does seem to kind of support this idea that the ants were maybe not bringing food to their neighbors as gifts, but the word gifts was never mentioned anywhere in the original argument. And bringing food to your neighbors doesn't necessarily have to be a gift. That doesn't mean that that's how it was necessarily used. So I would say that this is also out of scope. And then answer choice D, the ants to whom the particles were brought never carried the particles into their own colonies. That doesn't really change our conclusion. We know that these ants seem to be bringing food to their neighbors. Then we determine they're not bringing food to their neighbors. It doesn't really matter what the neighbors are doing with the food once it's brought. So the LSAT loves to present you with things that seem like somewhat related to the argument, but that don't actually have an impact on the premise and conclusion. One great thing to know about sufficient assumption questions is, as I mentioned earlier, they're really highly predictable, which means that the correct answer is highly likely to use the language or ideas of the premise and conclusion, which means out of all of the logical reasoning questions, these are kind of the least likely to get off topic in the answer choices. It's not totally impossible that it'll get off topic, but it's kind of correct or kind of uncommon for it to get off topic in the correct answer choices, I should say. So if I were to just be guessing on a sufficient assumption question, I would definitely want to guess an answer choice that used the language of the premise and conclusion, and not guess an answer choice that seemed to get pretty far off topic. Ooh, okay, let me read this question. Okay, so couldn't the argument be made for answer A that the assumption was made that the ants were sharing food based on human interactions between societies moving particles between each other could be assumed as food, since the initial research wasn't as conclusive that it was or was not food until a later date. It was assumed based on what human behavior and how human society would interact with each other. It is certainly possible, I would say, that this original argument was made on the basis of this idea that it looks like they're bringing food. Like if these were humans, if these ants were humans, we would think that they were bringing food. So we're kind of applying human principles to the ants. But we don't know that that is the reason that this original conclusion was drawn. If I were to just take answer choice A and plug it back in, what I would end up with is, okay, we know these ants carry particles to ant colonies. We know that they are dumping their own colony's dumping site. And now we also know that ants don't interact in all the same ways that human societies interact. Therefore, these ants are not bringing food to their neighbors. It doesn't really add the type of information that would allow me to conclusively decide that these ants are not bringing food to their neighbors. It would help me know they're not interacting in the same way that human societies interact, in all of the same ways, is important here. That means that maybe there are some of the ways that human societies interact that ants share, but not necessarily all of the ways. So for example, maybe ants build homes like humans do, but they don't share food. Or maybe ants do share food, but they don't build homes. So this statement is so broad that we wouldn't actually be sure if it applies to this particular situation of bringing food, or if it might apply to a different situation. Let me know if that helped, or if you have additional questions, happy to talk more about that. And let me see what Serena said. Serena, yeah, the terminology definitely helps here. So this is one where if you're leaning on the premise and the conclusion, you see that it talks about dumping sites in the premise, and we know that food is important to the conclusion. Yeah, that's perfect. So that would be a good guessing strategy, and also a good way to kind of like hone your hunches, basically. So if you had a hunch that answer choice C was correct, that would give you sort of one more point in its favor, and that would allow you to save time on the exam. I don't think it's a terrible strategy, although ideally you would feel confident with the conceptual basis of the argument, so you would understand the premise and conclusion. And probably the biggest challenge to that here is just rephrasing the conclusion to make it a little more clear. Another thing to consider is the difficulty level of the question. The first 5 questions of the LSAT tend to be, especially in logical reasoning, tend to be the easier questions within that section. So if it is an easier question, it is a little bit more reasonable for you to act on your instincts in order to save time for later questions that are going to be harder. All right, let me clear this off and take us to another question. There we go. All right, so now this is going to be question 13, which means that the difficulty is going to go up a bit. I'll give you a minute and 20 seconds for this one. All right, your poll is up. Tell me what you think. Okay, thank you. Got almost everybody voting here. And it looks like I will share with you that our three answers that most folks chose are A, C, and D. And I will tell you that one of those is the correct answer. But I want you to kind of think about the other answers that most folks picked and give them some consideration. See if you might like to change your answer or what you think might be wrong with the other answers. All right, so let's keep up these good habits. Tell me in the chat window, what do you think the conclusion of this argument is? Yep, M contains twice as many cans as L. Now, if you're like me, you're thinking to yourself, hey, I thought the LSAT didn't have math on it, and that was like the one good thing about taking this test. And now they're making me think about, percentages and that type of thing, and not cool at all. Whenever the LSAT starts getting into what we call quantitative logic, for me, that's definitely a sign that this question might be a little more difficult and that I'm going to want to slow down. And I may even need to take a little bit of notes. I usually don't take notes in logical reasoning. There's just not time. But maybe for 3 or 4 questions per section, if they are heavy on numbers or heavy on conditional logic, I might take some notes. And this would probably be one where I would break it down a little bit. So M contains twice as many cans as L. I'm going to break down the premises to make sure I understand where this is coming from. And this is an example of a question where I find it helpful to reorder the premises a little. So they start with 50% of the aluminum in M came from L, and then they say all of L were recycled into M. I'm going to start with that one. So all the cans in L were recycled into cans in M. And then they say that 50% of the aluminum in M is from L. So it's not 50% of the cans, it's 50% of the aluminum in these cans came from L. So I'm going to rephrase. So everything that L had to give in terms of aluminum resulted in 50% of the aluminum in M. So it's like 100% of L became 50% of M. And so that's where they're coming up with this idea that M contains twice as many cans as L. It's like we gave you, if we gave you 10 cans of L, and now only half of the aluminum in M came from L, then maybe there's just 20 cans of M. And maybe that's why 50%, 10 of the cans came from L. And then it adds in this one more premise that the amount of non-aluminum is negligible. All right, so we come to the conclusion M contains twice as many cans as L. We're trying to make that conclusion stronger. I would love to hear a little bit more about each of your answer choices in the chat window. Take a moment, tell me, you're going to be telling the whole group the letter of the answer that you chose and why you think that answer is correct. And if it was just kind of a guess, it's okay to tell me that too. Thanks, Serene. I'm going to keep waiting for another 45 seconds or so. Tell me why you picked the answer that you did. Thanks, Regina. Okay, so this particular question comes down to thinking about alternative possibilities. So one way to explain this situation is it seems like we had, 10 cans of L, but only half of the aluminum in M came from L. So we've just got 20 cans of M. We've got more cans. That's one possible way. If I start thinking, how else can I explain the premises? So how could it be true that all these L cans were recycled, only half of the aluminum in M came from L, and yet maybe M contains the same number of cans? Well, one possibility is, what if some of the aluminum gets lost along the way? So maybe L had, I don't know, like 100 grams of aluminum. I'm not sure how aluminum is measured. But maybe once it gets processed for recycling, only 50 grams are still available to be turned into cans. And so that goes into M. So if some of the aluminum gets lost along the way, we might have a different possible explanation besides just there are more cans than there are in L. So the correct answer to this question is answer choice C, which is that all of the aluminum in an aluminum can is recovered, which eliminates this possibility that maybe some of the aluminum just got lost along the way. And I see some new comments coming into the chat. I like that Kelsey said C because of the all factor. And that is an important word in this sufficient assumption answer choice. A lot of sufficient assumptions are going to use very extreme or absolute language to prove that the argument is going to be absolutely airtight. Yeah, it happens. Oh, well. Let's take a look at the other answer choices. So answer choice A, the aluminum in the cans of M cannot be recycled further, is kind of thinking about a different question than the one that we're talking about. We're wondering, does M have twice as many cans? And A is kind of thinking about what's going to happen in the future to those cans that are contained in M, which isn't a question that we need to worry about for this particular argument to be true. Answer choice D, none of the soft drink cans in group L had been made from recycled aluminum. That's an interesting one because it makes you start thinking like maybe they weren't 100% aluminum themselves, but notice that it mentions the amount of material other than aluminum is negligible, and there's nothing that's told to us that makes group L special. So as far as we know, L had as much aluminum as any other can, and having been made from recycled aluminum doesn't affect it, or at least not in a way that we're aware of, and we don't want to have to add any outside knowledge or ideas on the LSAT. All right, so we'll leave you with a couple of final thoughts on sufficient assumptions. The correct answers on these types of questions tend to, as we mentioned, use very strong or absolute language, which is often something that we shy away from on other types of questions in logical reasoning. So for example, if we were learning about inference questions tonight, I would have told you these 3 words right here are words to stay away from. But because we're working on sufficient assumption questions in particular, these words are often needed in order to be strong enough to make an argument airtight. All right, that is where we're going to wrap up for tonight. If you have any final questions, please feel free to stick around and grab the mic or tell me in the chat window. If you're interested in checking out our upcoming courses, there is our website. Thank you all for joining me. I hope you got something out of this and hope to see you in the future. I cannot see you. You can see me. But I could hear you if you wanted to click the microphone. No, next week's lesson will be about a different topic, Serene. And if you have any requests, I will actually be the person teaching next week's lesson, so I'm happy to take them. Kristen, can you be a little more specific? What do you mean, what do I recommend? Like, for what? Okay, reading comp could be fun. I will make a note of that, Serene. Yeah, no problem. Do you mean like what do I recommend for like how you should study, or like I'm just not sure I understand the question. Yes, got it. Serene, I have yours. Sorry, I'm responding to Kristen's question. Regina, that's inference question. So strong language is usually incorrect if you're dealing with, in particular, a most strongly supported inference question. Kristen, feel free to follow up there, but I would say in general, my first suggestion if you're getting started with the LSAT is to start by taking a practice test. So you can download the June 2007 practice test for free from our website. Oh, okay, gotcha, Kristen. Cool. So one thing that's really similar to this is our LSAT Interact. That's like a series of online self-study videos. So if you're interested in that sort of style of study, that would be a great resource. Our courses are also structured very similarly to what we did tonight. So it's visual in this way. There's an online instructor that you can see, and you actually can hop on the video and just be kind of almost like you're there, like a real live class. So those are both great options. We also have another free prep hour coming up next week on Sunday, December 16th. So if you'd like to do another free class like this, that's an option for you. Serena, unfortunately, not that I know of. All I know of is that the June 2007 test is available for free download. If you're interested in our material in particular, you could email our student services department and ask them if there's anything that can be done. Their email address is studentservices@manhattanprep.com.